This is a professional motion picture crew. They have agreed to let us observe in intricate detail the highly technical methods they employ to get the perfect image. By the end of this tape, you too will be better able to control photographic lenses. Hey, come back. Where's the location? Come back here.
How come they left you?
Just help me find him. I could have sworn they said...
Didn't you get a call sheet? You should have made sure you knew.
Just shut up and help me find him, okay?
Hey, over there. Over there.
Usually, the camera is loaded before leaving for the shoot. But since this cinematographer neglected to do that, we can observe. Inside the camera is the aperture opening, aperture plate, pressure plate, registration pin, and claw. The claw pulls down one frame of film every 1/24th of a second to expose 24 images each second. Most professional camera lenses have a movable ring that adjusts focus, the distance from the subject to the camera's focal plane.
Hey, focus. Focus.
There are several ways to focus a lens. One way is to measure the distance from the subject to the focal plane.
The what?
The focal plane marking indicates exactly where the film is being exposed inside the camera body. If by mistake you were to measure from the subject to the lens, you might get a shot that looks like this.
Yuck.
Now another way to focus is to look through the lens, but first you must focus the diopter, or eyepiece. 16mm cameras allow you to remove the lens and aim the camera at a bright area. Turn the eyepiece adjustment ring, or diopter, until the ground glass pattern in the eyepiece is sharp. Then you lock the eyepiece.
My camera lens doesn't come off.
Because you cannot remove the lens on most Super 8mm cameras, you need to set the focus to infinity. Then set the zoom ring to its most telephoto setting. Now, aim the camera at a subject more than 50 feet away. While looking through the camera, adjust the diopter until the image is in sharp focus. Then, lock the eyepiece.
Does that focus the lens?
No. Setting the diopter only focuses the eyepiece to a person's particular eyesight. You can't focus the lens without setting the diopter first.
How often do you need to set the diopter?
Only once, at the beginning of the shoot, as long as the same person is operating the camera. Each new camera operator needs to adjust the eyepiece to their particular eyesight. Otherwise, they won't be able to focus through the lens.
What kind of lens is that?
There are two main types of lenses, prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses have a single fixed focal length. Zoom lenses have variable focal lengths built into one lens. Focal lengths are marked on the zoom ring. The higher the millimeters, such as 120 millimeters, the more telephoto the lens. Focal length determines magnification of an image. This shot is taken with a 17mm lens. It's called a wide angle because the subjects appear distant and a lot of space is included in the frame. In this shot, taken with a 25mm lens, the subjects are not as distant and less space is included in the frame. In the 16mm format, this is called a normal focal length lens. In this shot, taken with a 70mm lens, often called a telephoto lens, the subjects seem very close and less area is included in the frame.
Let me try. A 17mm lens is a wide angle and we see a lot in the frame. A 25mm lens, sometimes called a normal focal length lens, shows me an image size close to what I see when I stand next to the camera. A 70mm or telephoto lens makes the subject look way close up. How come the background isn't in focus?
Focal length affects depth of field, a measure of how much area in the picture is in sharp focus. Shallow depth of field means only part of the image is in sharp focus. Telephoto lenses give shallow depth of field. In a shot with a shallow depth of field, you can rack focus, meaning focus is shifted during a shot. Shifting focus diverts attention from one plane of action to another. A wide depth of field means a lot of the image is sharp. Wide-angle lenses give a wider depth of field.
How come the background's out of focus in this shot?
Because the camera to subject distance also affects depth of field. Keeping the focal length the same when the camera is close to the subject, depth of field is more shallow. When the camera is further from the subject, depth of field is increased. Camera to subject distance also affects perspective.
What's perspective?
It's how far away from each other objects seem. To frame a medium shot with a wide-angle lens, the camera has to be fairly close to the subject. From this close position, the statue looks pretty far from the golfer. To get a similar composition with a normal focal length lens, we have to move the camera further back.
Now the statue seems closer to the golfer.
Very good. If we use a telephoto lens, we have to move even further away. The space appears compressed, and the statue seems very close to the golfer. Change in perspective is not a result of focal length, but of having to move the camera closer or further from the subject in order to get the composition you want. Now let's look at those shots again. Wide angle, normal lens, telephoto.
But I thought different focal lengths change the size of the image.
Well, they do, but we're changing the camera to subject distance to keep the subject the same size. Notice how close the car and the horse seem with a telephoto lens, and the camera far away. Space is flattened or compressed. By using a normal lens and bringing the camera closer,
The car seems further. Distance is expanded. I think I'm getting this.
compare the perspective in this shot and in the following shot. Can you tell what kind of focal lengths were used?
Why is he running?
To show that a telephoto lens seems to slow speed, because a telephoto lens placed at a distance from the subject compresses space. A wide-angle lens used close to the subject expands space, increasing perception of speed. You can instantaneously change focal length with a zoom lens. A zoom can zoom in, becoming more telephoto. Or it can zoom out, becoming more wide angle. To focus a zoom lens, zoom in all the way to telephoto, adjust your focus, then zoom out to the desired composition. A composition can be altered by dollying.
What's dollying?
With a dolly, the camera is physically moved through space. Dollying is dynamic because objects at various distances from the camera change size at different rates.
Look, the dog changes in size a lot more than a building, which is far away.
In a zoom, the camera is stationary. All objects, regardless of distance from the camera, change size in equal proportion. A zoom lacks a sense of movement through space.
How else can you change composition?
A tilt shot is when the camera is on a stationary pivot, such as a tripod, and the camera is angled up or down. In a crane shot, also called a boom shot, the entire camera is moved up or down. For a pan shot, also called panning, the camera is twisted right or left on a stationary axis. This is similar to turning your head to follow an action while you stand in one position. To execute a steady pan shot, the camera is mounted on a tripod.
That's cool. What happens if you move the camera?
Moving the entire camera is called a tracking shot. Tracking gives you the effect of moving through space. To execute a smooth tracking shot, The camera is usually mounted on a wheel dolly.
What happened to the picture?
The camera operator forgot to set the aperture.
The what?
The aperture. Each lens has an aperture, or iris opening. This opening can be made larger or smaller to let in more or less light. It works like the iris in the eye, which closes in bright light, opens when there's low light. Each lens has an aperture ring which adjusts the size of the opening. The numbers on the ring are called f-stops. The bigger the f-stop number, the less light. The smaller the f-stop number, the more light.
What else affects depth of field?
The last thing that affects depth of field is exposure. If the aperture is opened wide, likely at f2 or f2.8 for shooting in low light, you get a shallow depth of field. Note that the background is not in sharp focus. By adding more light and closing the aperture to f5.6 or f8 to compensate for the added light, we increase the depth of field. Now the background is in focus. Let's look at those again. Larger aperture, shallow depth of field. Small aperture, greater depth of field.
I get it. The brighter the light, the smaller the aperture, the larger the depth of field.
Well, it looks like they're getting ready to do that last shot of the day. That's a wrap. See you tomorrow at 5 a.m.
5 a.m.? Are you kidding?
Welcome to the world of filmmaking.